3 of the 4 Stoics we still read today were men of significant power. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome, the most powerful human being alive when he was writing the Meditations. He could have anyone executed, exiled, or enriched on a whim, and sometimes he did. Seneca was one of the richest men in the empire. Tutor to Nero, senator, owner of vast estates, lender of huge sums at interest. By some ancient accounts, the loan he called in from Britain may have helped trigger Boudicca's revolt. Musonius Rufus, the 4th main figure most people don't know, was an equestrian, the 2nd highest social rank in Rome, exiled by emperors but never poor. And then there's Epictetus, born a slave, crippled by his owner according to one tradition, freed eventually, taught philosophy out of a borrowed school, died with 1 lamp, 1 mat, 1 rug. So when people say Stoicism has a privilege problem, they're not making it up. The texts we have are mostly from men who never had to wonder where dinner was coming from. And the philosophy they wrote, keep your inner citadel, the externals don't matter, focus on what's in your control, can sound very different depending on who's saying it and who's listening. I want to take this critique seriously, not defend the Stoics, not throw them out either. Walk through what actually lands, what doesn't, and why I think the practice still matters even for people in positions the Stoics never had to occupy. Let me steelman this. The strongest version of the privilege critique goes something like this. When the most powerful man on earth tells you that the externals don't matter, what he's really saying is that his externals don't matter to him, because he has all of them. He doesn't have to worry about losing his job. He doesn't have to worry about being arrested for who he is. He doesn't have to worry about a parent's medical bills or a child's school or a landlord's notice. So of course he can write that the only thing that matters is the inner kingdom. He owns all the outer kingdoms already. When the rich man writes that wealth is indifferent, he writes it from inside the wealth. He never has to test the claim. And when this philosophy gets handed to someone who is actually being ground down by the world, by poverty, by discrimination, by violence, by systemic harm, and they're told, the externals don't matter, work on your judgment, accept what you cannot control, what they're being handed is, at best, a coping tool. At worst, it's a script for staying quiet while the people in power continue to benefit from things staying exactly as they are. This critique has been around as long as Stoicism has had Christian, Marxist, and feminist readers, and it's gotten sharper in the last few decades. Sandy Grant has written that Stoicism is philosophy for the powerful, not the powerless. Otter Lord's argument about anger as a tool of the oppressed is, structurally, a refusal of the Stoic move on anger. Bell Hooks kept pointing out that transform your inner life without transform the structures is a half philosophy. I don't think these critics are wrong. I think they're naming something real, and I think a serious Stoicism has to deal with it instead of pretending the question isn't there. Now, here's where I want to slow down. The critique lands hardest against a particular use of Stoicism. The version where you tell a struggling person, your suffering is your judgment, change your mind, the world is fine. That use of Stoicism is bad philosophy, bad ethics, and the Stoics themselves would have rejected it. But it doesn't quite land against the philosophy itself. Here's why. The first reason is named Epictetus. He wasn't a footnote. He was the most rigorous teacher of the school we have texts from. Marcus quotes him constantly. Almost everything we think of as core Stoic practice, the dichotomy of control, the discipline of assent, the focus on proherses, comes through Epictetus more than anyone else. And Epictetus was a slave. He wrote his philosophy not from a palace but from the bottom of the social order, and then from the precarious freedom that came after. When he says the only thing in your control is your judgment, he's not saying it from a position where everything else was secured for him. He's saying it from a position where almost nothing else could be secured for him. The philosophy held up under that pressure. It was tested. If the philosophy were only the rationalization of the powerful, Epictetus would not exist in the canon. He does. And the fact that Marcus, the emperor, kept Epictetus's words on his desk and copied them into his private journal tells you that the power wasn't generating the philosophy. The philosophy was answering a question both the slave and the emperor had. What do I do with the part of life I don't control? That question is universal. The answers don't all transfer cleanly, but the question does. The second reason is that the Stoics, including the rich and powerful ones, were not telling oppressed people to shut up. They were telling themselves not to be governed by externals they happened to possess. Marcus, in Meditations 6:30, writes one of the most striking lines in the book. Take care not to be Caesarified, not to be dyed in the purple. It happens. He knew the power was a danger to him. He was writing the practice as someone resisting the gravity of his own position, not someone exploiting it. Seneca is a more complicated case. He defended his own wealth in De Vita Beata, and the defense is uneven. He says the wise man does not love wealth but does not refuse it. He does not need a palace but can live in one without being ruined. He wouldn't refuse fortune's gifts but would not let them define him. You can read this as honest grappling or as motivated reasoning, probably both, but notice what he's not saying. He's not saying poor people should be content with poverty. He's saying rich people should not be enslaved by their riches. The audience is people in his position, talking to themselves. That changes what kind of failure the privilege charge is. It's a failure of application. The philosophy gets misapplied when it's taken from the rich talking to themselves and aimed at the poor as instruction. It's not mostly a failure of the doctrine. Mostly, now the part where I do think they overreached. Here's where I think the critique gets through. The Stoic doctrine of the indifference, the claim that wealth, health, status, freedom from violence are preferred indifference rather than goods proper, is technically careful and morally thin. It's technically careful because it lets you maintain that virtue is the only true good while still acknowledging that, yes, of course, you'd rather have your child healthy than sick. The Stoics are not idiots. They knew preferred indifference matter. But it's morally thin because the framing flattens distinctions that real ethics has to keep sharp. Being poor and being violently oppressed are not the same kind of preferred indifferent as being short instead of tall. The doctrine, as written, doesn't have great vocabulary for systemic injustice. It mostly thinks about wrong as something one person does to another, where the response is internal training. It doesn't have a strong theory of structural harm. That's a real gap, and it's the gap that modern critics like Hooks and Lord are pushing into when they say inner work alone is not enough. They're right. Inner work alone is not enough. That's a limit of the school as it survives in writing. The honest move is to admit it. Stoicism is a powerful psychological technology. It is an incomplete political philosophy. If you take it as a complete answer to a world with structural injustice in it, you will end up exactly where the critics say, counseling acceptance to people who should be organizing. A grown-up Stoicism uses the inner work to keep you functional and undefeated, while you do the outer work that the doctrine itself doesn't fully specify. The two don't compete. The Stoic surgery on rage and despair frees up energy. The energy has to go somewhere. The philosophy is silent on where. You have to bring that part yourself. So why bother if you're someone the Stoics weren't really writing for? Because the part they were right about is the part nobody else can give you. Nobody else can guard the inside of your head. Not your therapist, not your community, not your movement. Those things help and you need them. But the final wall, the one between your circumstances and your sense of who you are, that wall you build yourself with whatever tools you can find. Stoicism is among the best tools ever written for that wall. Epictetus knew. He built his with no other materials. When the world is doing you harm, two things are happening at once. There's the harm, which is real and which you should resist by every legitimate means. And there's what the harm is doing inside you, the bitterness, the despair, the contempt, the slow erosion of your sense that you are still a person worth being. The first you fight in the world, the second you fight in your own head. The Stoics give you weapons for the second fight. Without those weapons, the first fight breaks you long before it ends. This is not just change your mindset. It is, do not let them have the inside too. It is what Frederick Douglass found in Stoic-shaped resistance literature. It is what every prisoner of conscience who survived their imprisonment with their dignity intact has, in some version, practiced. It is not a substitute for justice. It is what keeps you human while you fight for justice. Here's how I hold all of this. The Stoics had real privilege and a real philosophy. Both things are true. The privilege colored what they noticed and what they didn't. The philosophy still works in places the privilege never reached. Epictetus is the proof, and the place to start reading if you came in skeptical. What I won't do is what some defenders of Stoicism do. Pretend the critique isn't real, hand-wave it with but the philosophy itself is fine, or use Marcus and Seneca's words to tell suffering people their suffering is a thinking error. That's bad philosophy and worse ethics, and the Stoics themselves, at their best, would not have done it. What I also won't do is what some critics do, throw the texts out because the authors had power. The texts are tested, they work. Epictetus tested them. Boethius tested them in a death cell. Generations of people, in positions the senators never imagined have tested them, and reported back that the inner citadel holds. You don't throw out a tool because someone who didn't need it was the first one to write down how it works. You take the tool, you notice the hand that made it, you use it for the work in front of you, and you bring your own politics to the parts the toolmaker didn't address. That's not a Stoicism that hides from the privilege charge. That's a Stoicism that's mature enough to admit the charge is partly right, keep the part that survives, and put it to work for people the original writers never met.